Bef- um, Dr. Ralph Gigliotti, he is the director of the Center for Organizational Leadership at Rutgers University, where he provides executive leadership for the portfolio of signature academic leadership programs, consultation services, and research initiatives. He also serves as an associate faculty member in the PhD program in higher education and as a part-time lecturer in the Department of Communication. Besides his book on crisis leadership in higher education, he has co-authored 2 other books, Leadership, Communications and Social Influence in the Personal and Professional Context, and A Guide for Leaders in Higher Education, Core Concepts, Competencies, and Tools. He also has many journal article publications. The most recent, I believe, would be this morning, where he published a summary of major findings from a study of department chairs across the Big Ten universities. It was published, as I said, just this morning in Inside Higher Education. Dr. Gigliotti is also a national examiner for the Malcolm Baldrige Performance Excellence Program. He is also actively involved in numerous boards and leadership teams, including the leadership team of the Training and Development Division for the National Communication Association and the Board of Directors for the Network for Change and Continuous Innovation. We're very happy that Dr. Gigliotti is joining us this evening. Welcome, Dr. Gigliotti. You have the baton, so I'm going to turn the platform over to you.
All right. Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Thank you for the kind introduction, Lynn, and for the invitation to join you all. There are so many conveniences with this technology that we have available to us. Although as I was looking at the website for Texas A&M Corpus Christi, I was sort of jealous that we are in this, or angry that we're in this condition we're in right now, because the campus looks stunning. The island university looks beautiful. And as we were talking about a little earlier, my guess is that it's a little bit warmer there than it might be in New Jersey right now. But it's so good to see you all. I'm really excited to be here. This is a topic I have been thinking a lot about very clearly because of the circumstances that we find ourselves in. And I so appreciate such a diverse group being with us this evening. I am going to talk for a bit about my research, about the book, about sort of what's on my mind right now regarding crisis and leadership and the intersection of these 2 areas at this moment in time, particularly for colleges and universities across the country. And what I'm also hoping we'll be able to do is leave a whole lot of time at the end of the session for questions and conversation. I'm happy to talk about how I converted a dissertation into a book project. For those of you that are PhD students or PhD candidates, I'm happy to talk about how I survived the PhD program with the birth of my son at the same time and what that was like. And for those of you that are in administrative or faculty roles, I'm happy to talk about whatever is on your mind with the issues that you're wrestling with right now. I might not have so many answers, but I'm happy to engage in some conversation and share what I can from the research that I've conducted on the topic. So this is a topic that I care a lot about, so much so that I have a 5-year-old son now, a 3-year-old daughter, and a baby who was born in March. So March 19th, right when the pandemic was underway in the US. And I've written a little bit about this in other places, but I recall vividly standing in the hospital room after my daughter was born. And here you have this sort of innocent, beautiful, calm at the time, she's now crawling everywhere, baby. And outside of the hospital, they were setting up the drive-in testing clinic for COVID. We were not allowed to have anyone visit us to see her. And it's been a weird few months for her in terms of her worldview and her paradigm, because she hasn't really seen many folks except through screens. And the stock market was collapsing on March 19th. And for me, it really speaks to this idea of opportunity and beauty and awakening that can arise during times of crisis. And I tend to have a really positive outlook, although I write about crisis and crises. And we're going to sort of talk about that this evening. But I shared that I really enjoy thinking about this topic, so much so that my son the other day was sitting downstairs on our ottoman holding up a book, and I asked him what he was reading about, and my 5-year-old said crisis leadership. So I guess I talk about this a lot at home as well. So I want to start with a quick story. This campus here is where I did my undergrad. It's at Duquesne University in the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So right downtown. It's a lovely campus. It's a Catholic campus founded by the Puritan Fathers. And Duquesne is situated at the top of this hill, and it's called the Bluff. So has a sort of a nice suburban feel where you're away from the city. But if you look around the campus, the buildings and skyscrapers of downtown Pittsburgh are in the distance. It's a really beautiful campus. And I had a really terrific undergraduate experience at Duquesne. And my senior year, we were starting my senior year at Duquesne, and I was student body president. And I recall being in one of the residence halls not far from where this picture was taken. And outside of the windows, we could see a lot of sirens and we could hear a lot of sirens. But it wasn't atypical because, again, we were downtown in the middle of the city. Our phones started to ring quite frequently from the room that we were in, and we soon learned that there was a shooting on campus where 5 student athletes were shot as they were leaving an on-campus dance. And the shooting was caused by visitors to the campus who were not affiliated with the university. And it was a really, really awful situation for, of course, the victims who all survived the accident, and for their families, and for the campus, especially since it was an unprecedented event for the campus. And it led to a whole lot of soul searching across the university around how we could recover from the crisis, how we could heal the wounds and the divisions. There were some underlying diversity and equity issues that were being discussed at the time of the crisis. And we talked a lot about what it means to draw upon, in the words of the president at the time at the university, a reservoir of goodwill that we could pull from to cope with the issue at hand and to recover stronger from the crisis. And for me, folks, that ended up being a window into crisis leadership at a university that set me on a career and set me in pursuit of studying this more deeply in my master's work at Villanova and then my doctoral work at Rutgers. As Lynn mentioned, I am the director of the Center for Organizational Leadership. We are an active research center at the university that reports to our executive vice president for academic affairs. And we like to talk about our role as being a hub for academic leadership development, consultation, and research. So we do a lot of programming for faculty and staff and doctoral students across the university in the area of academic leadership development. We also will work with units and departments on strategic planning and priority setting and change leadership and crisis leadership. And as Lynn was suggesting in her comments, we do a lot of research as well. So the piece, I'll hopefully have a little bit of time at the end of the presentation to talk about the challenges posed by COVID-19 for those who occupy the role of department chair. And I don't know if we have department chairs in the audience now, but those are really complex roles to begin with during normal times. There's sort of a lot of ambiguity and there's a liminality associated with the role where you're sort of caught between the forces of faculty and administration. And then you layer on a global pandemic and it complicates the roles even further. So we do a lot of research that then feeds back into the programs that we provide. So I think about a lot of these topics from an applied perspective. And you'll see from some of the books that we've worked on in the center, my interests really lie at the intersection of leadership and communication and crisis within the context of higher education more broadly. And we're now working on a book on leadership in academic health centers that we will use for our academic health center faculty leadership program. So to begin, I am going to minimize the one of my screens here. So if anyone poses a question in the chat room, hopefully, Lynn, you could just let me know in case I miss it. And again, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end of the presentation as well. So making sense of contemporary crises is where I want to begin. This idea of crisis is an interesting one, and it's a ubiquitous term. It's widely invoked. And prior to the pandemic, it felt as if we were in this sort of perpetual state of crisis in higher education, where there were lots of threats to the work we were doing and critiques to the work we were doing. We were facing lots of budget issues in the making at some of our universities, varying degrees of public perception of the work that we do. And you read through Inside Higher Ed or the Chronicle of Higher Ed, and it felt as if higher education was in a state of crisis. And then we are dealing now with the global pandemic. And that has just amplified these forces that were already at play. And it has threatened so much of the work that we do in higher education. There is a general agreement that crises disrupt and derail organizational practices, that crises threaten the reputations of individual leaders and organizations, and that crises require a rapid response. For my dissertation project and for the work that I've done since then, I was really interested in exploring further this idea of crisis as a social construction. So how do we differentiate a crisis from a non-crisis or a potential crisis? And as I learned from my interviews with several senior leaders from different universities, this idea of crisis often lies in the eye of the beholder. With that being said, the ability to make sense of crisis situations remains a core leadership imperative. And it's important also for the many stakeholders who engage in the activities of organizational life: our students, our alumni, our parents, our benefactors, and donors, for some universities, local and regional and state governments, etc. In one of the papers I worked on recently, I highlighted 3 cases where some were invoking the word crisis to characterize them. And in other cases, there were those who disagreed that perhaps it didn't rise to the level of crisis. The first is the case at the University of Missouri, where a number of racially charged incidents led to a number of public protests, including a hunger strike and an outcry from the football team. And that was inspired by acts of racial injustice in the nearby Ferguson region. In the second case, there was the debate over the statue of Silent Sam at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And this statue that, in the eyes of some, was an important marker of the university's history and the university's heritage, and it deserved prominent placement at the entrance to the flagship campus. Whereas for others, it's a symbol of a moment in time that does not merit inclusion on the flagship campus. And it's a symbol of pain and of harm and of damage. And then at the University of Missouri, there was the really awful and unfortunate death of a student athlete, Jordan McNair. And some were writing about this toxic athletics culture at the university, and that there was a crisis in the making, whereas others viewed it and treated it as an isolated incident. In these cases, there's something at play here, where those who occupy positions of leadership at times can perceive crises in fundamentally different ways than others, such as students, who might view the crisis or sets of crises through different lenses. Now, we compare those examples with the COVID-19 pandemic, for instance. I think you will be hard to find someone who isn't willing to classify what we're going through right now and what we've been going through over these last 7-8 months as an awful crisis. We look at widespread physical destruction in the aftermath of major natural disasters, such as the impact of Hurricane Maria at the University of Puerto Rico or Hurricane Florence at UNC Wilmington. We look at the sexual abuse scandals at Penn State and Michigan State. These examples threaten the reputation of the institution. They disrupt our core mission, and they place a prominent spotlight. They shine this spotlight on the behaviors of those engaged in leadership across the institution. What makes what we're dealing with right now with the pandemic so striking and so unsettling and so concerning is just the length of time that we've been in this and the uncertainty that it has posed for all the work that we do. Not one department at our universities has not been impacted by the crisis. And what's particularly interesting when we think about organizational learning, in March and in April, colleges and universities, you sort of had this feeling we're looking around and seeing what others were doing, and we're responding to the crisis at hand. And we all pivoted quite quickly into this fully online environment. And I think there's something that we should be proud of in how we responded to that. But now what's different is universities are responding in different ways to the crises at play. And there are important reputational implications at stake. And of course, the implications on human lives that are impacted by the virus. So we find ourselves now at this truly historic moment in time where we are dealing with a convergence and a collision of crises. Crises posed by the pandemic, crises posed by this national reckoning of racial justice across our country, climate change, the economy, political debates that are far from ordinary, and we're left with what Carl Weick might refer to as a cosmology episode, where there is a true collapse in sense making. How do we begin to make sense of this moment in time, especially for those of us that have been personally impacted in dramatic ways by any of these crises? If you've lost someone to the virus, if you've lost a home or some property or a loved one because of the impact of climate change, if you've been furloughed from your job because of the economy, or if you come from an underrepresented background and are witnessing what's happening across this country with great pride and with great fear. This is an important moment in time, and it's a moment of crisis. So what I want to do with the next set of slides here is highlight some of the literature that I build upon in the book to offer some commentary on crisis leadership and what I understand crisis leadership to be and what I understand it to mean. So my PhD is in communication. I come at this from a communication perspective. And according to one of the seminal scholars in the field, Tim Coombs, crises are unpredictable phenomena, yet not unexpected. Now, as Lynn held out my book, I'm ashamed to acknowledge that if you go through the book and read it line by line, it makes for great bedtime reading, as I've been told by some. But I hope there are pieces of it that are exciting for you as you're reading it. But what's really interesting is that I don't mention the word pandemic anywhere. I think now, if we were to work on a second edition of the book, we clearly would acknowledge the impact that a pandemic could have on our institutions. And when we look at the etymological roots of crisis, the two symbols that are used in the Chinese language, in Mandarin, to represent crisis, some have suggested reflect the words danger and the word opportunity. That within crisis lies a dangerous opportunity. And if you go way back to look at the true roots of the word crisis, it actually means a turning point. And it was written from the perspective that in a sickness and in major sickness, a crisis was part of this turning point when you became healthy. And over time, that turning point has taken on a negative connotation. But communication, according to Matt Seeger, plays an important role in crisis. It's necessary for meaning making around what are very uncertain and unequivocal events. Internal and external stakeholders are very much impacted by contemporary crises. And these stakeholders often play a role in the very generation of the crisis itself. And I'll share more on that topic later on. But when we look at crisis as a social construction, we're impacted by crises, but we actually constitute the crisis through the ways in which we talk about it and respond to it. And one last point regarding the stakeholders. According to Lori Lewis, stakeholders enact the organization as the embodiment of their own purposes. Their sense of how activities are related, how people are known, how outcomes arise, and how processes unfold. So stakeholders, through communication, help to create the organization. And so an understanding of crisis leadership, for me, calls for us to take communication seriously. So I keep referring to this idea of the social construction of crisis. And let me unpack that a little further for you. Fairhurst and Connaughton wrote some really interesting pieces looking at the intersection of leadership and communication. And they suggest that post-positivist approaches to leadership privilege communication as constitutive of leadership itself. So there's a constitutive function to communication, that it actually creates these worlds that we then embody and live in. Bloomer refers to a renewed emphasis on social interaction, whereby participants are developing lines of action in the multitudinous situations they encounter. So if you're not familiar with the social construction literature, it's really fascinating. I find it to be useful in thinking about how crises are called into existence. And I can't really do the topic justice with the limited time that we have today, but I would certainly point you to Bloomer's work as some foundational writing. And if you're interested in the topic, I'm happy to point you to some other resources in the field as well. But for me, when we think about the social construction of crisis, it calls for a consideration of the ways in which human actors or those engaged in active leadership respond to situations and the ways in which they respond to other individuals based on the meaning that these situations or individuals have on them. So to go back to the University of Missouri case, and we've done some writing based on the news reporting of what happened in that case, we have this situation where students who are extremely angry and upset and feel hurt approach the president during a homecoming parade, who fails to get out of the car to address them. And there's a situation here where the leadership response doesn't align with the urgency or severity of the situation. So as I write in a recent piece, if there's the perception of crisis, then there's the existence of crisis. Lastly, before we talk about crisis leadership, what do we mean by leadership itself? Fairhurst and Grant describe how communication becomes more than a simple transmission, but it's a medium by which the negotiation and construction of meaning takes place. So communication is more than a tool. And that was something that really inspired my work in this area. When we look at crisis in higher education, there's a tendency to think about the role of communication as being, how can we spin our way out of this mess to preserve our reputation? And sure, that's an important part of crisis leadership. How can you use communication to deliver messages, to connect with people, to express urgency, to protect lives, and to preserve the reputation? But if that's the only response, if that's the only role we're thinking of communication as, it seems limited, it seems short-sighted, and it doesn't bring attention to the importance of values-centered leadership, as we'll talk more about later. So Grint has done some really fascinating writing on contingency theories of leadership, and that isolate the leader, context, situation, and followers, and he calls those limited. And he encourages us to focus on the role of leaders and decision makers in the construction of contexts that legitimates their intended or executed actions and accounts. Isn't that fascinating when we think about that in the context of crisis? How do we refer to these situations and actually designing an environment, a context that makes what we're doing as leaders permissible? How do we actually construct the crisis to short circuit decision making or shortcut decision making? It's quite a fascinating concept. So this is how we have been writing about and thinking about leadership in our center. My mentor, my dissertation chair, Brent Rubin, we've done a lot of writing together on the intersection of leadership and communication. We've been thinking about it recently as the design and implementation of messages, strategies, processes, and structures to facilitate social influence. So for those of you that are in positions of leadership at the university, you could think about the messages that you're sending out to deliver important content to others, to engage in planning and priority setting. But what are the processes that allow for decision making? What are the structures in place that allow for engagement? That becomes part of the leadership endeavor. And for students that are here, you might hear the word leadership and think about it as something distant from what you're experiencing now, because I'm only a doctoral student. How much influence do I have? But treat the dissertation process as an opportunity for leadership. For me, designing a committee in collaboration with my chair and creating the conditions for us to have open and honest dialogue, to build upon my research and to also invite others to contribute to that research and to help me make sense of these topics, it becomes a leadership imperative. So leadership is a process, and some of the writing on leadership looks at leadership as a verb more so than the leader as the noun. And that's what a communication lens allows us to do. One last piece about leadership more broadly, and then we're going to dive into what this means for higher ed right now. Barbara Kellerman at Harvard, at the Kennedy School of Government, talks about the leadership system, and that we can't just talk about leaders, but we need to look at the intersection of leaders, followers, and context. And it's at this intersection where leadership becomes possible and where leadership analysis becomes really fascinating. So when I think about crisis leadership, then I tend to view crisis leadership as a construct that's more than, but includes preparing for crisis, preventing crises or risks, engaging in communication during all of the stages of crisis, and the active management of crisis. But more than these other functions, it's about an understanding of and appreciation for communication, for others, for the core values and mission of your institution. And then when crisis strikes and the spotlight is on you and your institution, in what ways are those values serving as a guide, serving as an anchor? In what ways are you building dialogue with those most directly impacted by the crisis? In what ways are you taking care of the perception and taking care to ensure that you understand the perceptions that others bring to crisis situations? All of that for me becomes part of what I understand crisis leadership to be. So before I talk about my study, and I don't want to spend too much time on the research design because I know some of you have already read the book, but I do want to give you some highlights in case you haven't had a chance to read it. Or for those of you that aren't familiar with some of the concepts in the book, we talk about crisis, and I talk about crisis in the context of higher ed as being particularly challenging for a lot of reasons. One, we have a diversity of internal and external stakeholders, perhaps more so than a lot of other organizational types. Social media, as I'll share a little bit later, as one of the findings, was presented as a challenging consideration for leaders in higher education, that these technologies have heightened the voices of many stakeholders who perhaps once did not hold privileged voices in our institutions. that leadership and decision making, again, those of you that hold administrative roles, you recognize this firsthand. Decision making is distributed, and this model of shared governance and decentralized processes have helped us create what we've created. And but they've also, the structure itself leads to some challenges in terms of decision making. And as I alluded to earlier, higher education is and was under siege. If you look at the New York Times today, right next to the Amy Coney Barrett announcement is an essay talking about the financial challenges that higher education is dealing with right now. So it continues to be at top of mind for all of us. Why don't I stop for just a moment and see, does anyone have any burning questions that you just need to raise right now before I go into some of the details from my study? And if not, if you want to just save the question, we'll get to it in just a moment.
I know in the chat box there were a couple of contributions that the definition that you and Ruben had with the leadership is the design and structure. It had a lot of meaning for folks.
That's great, Lynn. Thank you for that. And thanks for those who offered those comments. Okay. So for those of you that are doctoral students or doctoral candidates, I was encouraged to choose a dissertation topic that would be timely and timeless, one that would be fascinating for me, one that would pique my curiosity, one that I could spend a whole lot of time studying, and one that would hold up to the test of time in terms of offering contributions. For me, practice was very important as an applied researcher, but also for scholarship. And I appreciate the comment about public school leadership and APA 7. I think some of what I'm going to share is about leadership and education more broadly, even though the context that I studied it in was in higher education specifically. And at public schools, I studied this topic at both public and private universities. So universities that, for my sample, were members of the Association of American Universities, the AAU. And I used APA 6 and not APA 7. But I've been using APA 7 a little bit more with some of the recent work I've done. So your dissertation is very much informed by your research questions, and to have really to pose questions that you're interested in and that you're excited about and that you feel like could make a contribution. And these were the questions that I used for the dissertation, which I modified quite a bit as I worked on the project. And then eventually these served as the core questions for the book on crisis leadership. What events or situations are characterized as crises in higher education? How do these events or situations become defined and labeled as crises? What are the prominent characteristics of the discourse around crisis and crisis leadership in higher education? How do we talk about it? And what skills, values, and competencies are important for the work of crisis leaders in higher education? And how did I go about studying this? From a 5-year period, 2011 to 2015, I chose a sample of articles from that time in the Chronicle of Higher Education and Inside Higher Ed, along with a smaller sample from the New York Times and Wall Street Journal. And I looked at what the authors were referring to as crisis. So I did a search, a content analysis of these articles, and using a taxonomy, tried to sort of better understand what situations were being described as crises. And over a 5-year period, after I removed, for examples that were irrelevant to the scope of my project, such as the Syrian refugee crisis, for instance, it didn't have anything to do with higher education crisis specifically. I pulled those out of the sample and was left with 1,000 articles, 1,000 articles that described a crisis in higher education. And then to study the second, third, and fourth questions, I engaged in semi-structured interviews with 37 senior leaders from different divisions of the universities. And these were schools representing the AAU, both public and private, all within the US. And these were institutions that dealt with one of the crises that I discovered in my content analysis, one of the crisis types. So that was my research design. So what events or situations are characterized as crises in higher education? What did I learn from this question? First, that the domain of the crisis matters. In some cases, the crisis was institution specific, such as the Penn State scandal. And in other cases, the crisis was bigger, a crisis in the book publishing industry, a crisis in a financial crisis plaguing higher education, a crisis of the academic labor market, etc. Who holds responsibility for the crisis? In some cases, it was a specific unit that was responsible for the crisis. But in almost all of the cases that I analyzed, it became clear that crises, as the authors were pointing this out in some of the writings, had an interdependent influence on multiple units. And lastly, who gets to declare something a crisis? And in those 1,000 journal articles and Inside Higher Ed and Chronicle articles that I searched, the news articles that described a crisis in higher education, a huge percentage were those declared by the journalist and not necessarily a direct quote from a member of the institution. And these were the crisis types that emerged from my research. There were academic crises, such as widespread plagiarism or significant violations of academic integrity, athletics crises, clinical crises, a financial or business crisis, human resources crisis. These were crises germane to employee crimes or issues regarding hiring and firing of employees. A leadership or governance crisis. A lot of writing at this time was focused on the University of Wisconsin and some of the controversies that were happening there between the university and the state legislature. Natural disasters, public safety crises, racial or identity conflict, student affairs crises, and technological crises. And under that technological umbrella, I include water main breaks and chemical spills, some of those facilities-specific crises. How do these events or situations become defined and labeled as crises? Again, I'll move pretty quickly through this so we have a lot of time for conversation. But at a high enough level, some of the themes that came out of this conversation: one, multiple definitions of crises exist. Crises are distinct from other events or situations, and social media has a huge impact on this. So this was the definition of crisis that I put forward in the book. That's again informed by the research that I gathered. That crises are events or situations of significant magnitude that threaten our reputations, impact the lives of those involved in the institution, disrupt the ways in which the organization functions, have a cascading influence on leadership responsibilities and obligations across units or divisions, and require an immediate response from leaders. So again, think about the pandemic. I think it meets the criteria put forward here. But interestingly, crisis lies in the eye of the beholder. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. What's really fascinating, I think I interviewed 37 senior leaders. Every single person that I interviewed mentioned the challenges posed by social media. That social media has an important role to play in accelerating, accentuating, and escalating events or situations to a perceived level of crisis. As one of my respondents suggested, I think it's just very clear that the world we all operate in has changed dramatically. Things that 10 or certainly 15 years ago would have flown under the radar, now anybody can become a quasi-journalist. Sometimes I'm asked too, is social media a bad thing? And as a number of the respondents highlighted in our interviews, social media plays a hugely important role in being able to disseminate information in a really prompt manner in ways that with some crises that happened, a decade or more ago, perhaps we're unable to do. You can see this other quote here. We have to be much more sensitive to the fact that issues or challenges can escalate much, much more rapidly. And this person went on to describe how disgruntled employees can put something out there and have this issue or situation receive pretty widespread attention in ways that perhaps wasn't once possible. For the third research question, what are the prominent characteristics around the discourse of crisis and crisis leadership? How do we talk about this as leaders? And this was certainly the most theoretical part of the dissertation project. And let me highlight some of these themes for you. And I'm going to provide some specific quotes from my respondents to bring these ideas to life for you. So the first, and it's an article that I just published on this with this very title in the Journal of Applied Communication Research, if you're interested. The perception of crisis involves the reality of crisis. That crises are said to exist because of the ways in which people perceive the situation and because of the ways that leaders talk about the situation. Look at this quote. A crisis, it's not necessarily some external thing that's imposed on our institutions. It sometimes can be that. It's only flamed by a lack of immediate attention. You have to trust that even if you're the leader, if someone else sees something as a crisis, you have to listen. The second theme was about the framing of crisis by leaders. In what ways do leaders manage meaning? And how do we make things into crisis? Look at this quote I share here from a chief of staff for a president. If I go to the president and I say, this issue has the potential to become a full-blown crisis if this isn't addressed quickly, I want his antenna to go up because my use of that term is intentional. A number of folks with whom I spoke described this as the baggage, that crisis has baggage, the label itself, partially because it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, that the news trucks show up and suggest, oh my gosh, it's a crisis. What they're looking for, and they love to come out here and do man on the street interviews to see if they can get a student to say, oh, it's horrible. Then sometimes we have a tendency to react to that. When I think about the crisis as a self-fulfilling prophecy, it involves this idea of communication surrounding crisis, heightening emotions, attracting greater attention, and creating the conditions through which we experience crises themselves. And as I highlighted earlier, the term crisis has baggage and creates a certain level of additional fear and concern that isn't necessarily always the best thing for addressing an issue that higher ed has to address. So I'm sort of approaching the end of the research project, and I just have a couple of comments regarding the crises that we're in today and some thoughts for where we are now, and then I want to leave the rest of our time for Q&A. What are some of the implications for how we practice crisis leadership? And this comes out of the fourth research question that I posed. A couple that I'll highlight here, and I go into more depth in the book on each of these, that perception matters, particularly as we manage these very large, complex institutions where anyone can help to elevate something to the level of crisis. That perception becomes a really important and challenging endeavor. I wrote about the countercultural need for agility, that higher education is held to the same standards for speed and agility when crises strike as some of our corporate neighbors down the street. But culturally, we're not as likely to respond with that same speed and agility because of the design of our systems, because we engage in thoughtful, collaborative decision-making, because we rely on so many committees to do the work of the academy. And that has been a hallmark for us. That's contributed to great excellence in our organizations. I think there's a lot of pride, as I was suggesting earlier, for how we as a sector were able to respond to the pandemic in ways that perhaps surprised us and our institutions. But there's a lot of learning to be done about how we can move beyond this as well. One of the other ones I'll highlight here is this idea of learning from crises and crisis leadership across sectors. We tend to think of higher education as being unique as a system or a structure, and in a lot of ways there are some unique qualities to it for sure. But we can also learn from crises that other organizations are wrestling with. Again, because when the spotlight shines on our institutions, Rutgers is based in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and right across from the campus is Johnson & Johnson's headquarters. And we learn a lot from how they respond to crises and vice versa. But more often than not, it's us learning from them, and also learning from some of the failures as well. Okay, so that's the dissertation and the book and some of my recent research on crisis leadership. And I want to talk briefly about where we are today, and then turn it over to you all. It's remarkable that we're still wrestling with this pandemic. It has been fueled in many ways by misinformation and disinformation. The loss of life is staggering. The financial impact on our institutions is overwhelming. I have so many close colleagues who have been furloughed or have been laid off because of the pandemic, and some are predicting that there's a whole lot more in store. So it's a scary time. And I don't know how many of you have read Rebecca Solnit's book, but she wrote a book a while back called A Paradise Built in Hell. And I love this idea that she raises. She talks about the ways in which community can arise from disaster. But she suggests that if paradise now arises in hell, it's because in the suspension of the usual order and the failure of most systems, we are free to live and act another way. That crisis serves as an awakening. That crisis, as some have defined it, can be a necessary corrective. That crisis can reveal what's broken. That crisis can actually energize us to solve problems in ways that we may not have been able to solve them before. So there is opportunity for each of us and our institutions in crisis. And I have lots of questions regarding what higher education will look like on the other side of this crisis. We could talk more about that later if you want to discuss some of your ideas, and I have some of my own. But I did want to share with you all very briefly a quote from Rebecca Solnit. She wrote a piece in The Guardian, and it's so beautiful. I just have to read the whole quote if you don't mind me reading it. She wrote about the first lesson that a disaster teaches us is that everything is connected. She wrote this in The Guardian in probably the second or third month of the pandemic in the US. But listen to this language. Quote, "When a storm subsides, the air is washed clean of whatever particulate matter has been obscuring the view, and you can often see farther and more sharply than at any other time. We may feel free to pursue change in ways that seemed impossible while the ice of the status quo was locked up. We may have a profoundly different sense of ourselves, our communities, our systems of production, and our future. That when the storm subsides, we can see more clearly." Wyke refers to the fog, and when we can wade our way through the fog, we sometimes can see things with greater clarity. And I was struck by this poem when I when I read it in, I think it was probably in April. And although many of us are no longer in active quarantine, I think there's so much to this that's still so powerful. I'll give you a moment to read the poem to yourselves. it's that last part that really gets to me. And when the danger passed, we were able to create new ways to live and heal the earth fully as they had been healed. We don't know when we'll be out of this mess. But I do know that higher education has much to learn, and we've been engaged in a whole lot of learning and soul searching throughout this crisis. And I'm sure for the doctoral students in the room and doctoral candidates, lots of questions about, a reminder for why we study this topic. What about educational leadership are we excited about? What energizes us? Who do we want to be? What are the questions we're interested in? And I think it's a moment for deep reflection for each of us, and who we are as leaders and who we are as people. So my research has built upon this crisis leadership work. I've worked on a few essays recently. The perception of crisis piece is one. The second one was an essay I just wrote for the Journal of Literacy and Technology on what we've learned from the sudden shifts to fully online and early perceptions of crisis preparedness at our institutions. And lastly, this Big Ten department chair project regarding competing perceptions of reinvention. I could talk more about this in the Q&A if you're interested, but the one thing I'll highlight that's really fascinating, there were about 170 department chairs that responded to the survey, and about 80 or 90 completed the full survey. And I asked the question, we're hearing a lot of talk about reinventing higher education. How do you feel about that? And there were some that were very energized and excited about reinvention. There were some that were deeply skeptical of reinvention, that it just meant that resources would be taken away and that their programs would be shut down. And for a good majority of the chairs, many were uncertain of what reinvention meant. But one of the things I advocate for in the piece is that we need to give chairs a voice at the table to share what reinvention could look like. But as the chairs highlighted in the research, they are, for many, very much overwhelmed. And the liminality of their role, where they're constantly pivoting to these different stakeholders, has just been amplified in ways that are unhealthy, in ways that are deeply problematic. So a lot of support is needed for individuals in these roles, including, and I advocate for this a lot because of the work we do in our center, training and networking and resources and community building. Okay, so that is my formal presentation. I'm going to stop sharing here so